On the morning of January 14th, 2025, a Chinese naval task force did not alter course. That single decision, quiet, deliberate, and made with full knowledge of an American warning transmitted through back-channel diplomatic circuits 48 hours prior, marked the moment the rules of maritime engagement in the Persian Gulf entered a new era. Not because a shot was fired, because one wasn't. The assumption most analysts carried into that week was that Beijing would blink, that the presence of the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, positioned 60 nautical miles south of the Strait of Hormuz, represented sufficient deterrent leverage to redirect the PLA Navy's Surface Action Group back toward the South China Sea. That assumption was wrong, and the cascading consequences of that miscalculation are still unfolding in ways that most Western commentators have not yet fully mapped. Here is what the official record tells us, and here is what it conceals. Washington's public posture in the days following the incident was carefully managed. Pentagon spokespeople described the encounter as a routine navigation exercise on the part of both nations. State Department briefings leaned heavily on the language of de-escalation. Phrases like open lines of communication and professional maritime conduct appeared in 3 consecutive press releases issued between January 15th and January 18th. The narrative Washington wanted the world to absorb was one of mature great power restraint. 2 professional militaries operating within the framework of international maritime law, exchanging signals, respecting lanes, and ultimately returning to their respective operational theaters without incident. That framing held for approximately 11 days, until satellite imagery analyzed by the Middlebury Institute and subsequently published by 2 independent defense journalists revealed something the official statements had omitted entirely. The Chinese task force, led by the Type 055 destroyer Nanchang, the most capable surface combatant in the PLA Navy's inventory, had not simply transited the Gulf of Oman and turned north. It had conducted a full intelligence collection pass along the Omani coastline, loitering for approximately 19 hours within 40 nautical miles of the Royal Air Force of Oman's primary air defense radar installation at Thumrait. The Nanchang was accompanied by a Type 093B nuclear-powered attack submarine operating in a submerged escort posture, a detail confirmed not by American officials, but by Indian naval tracking stations operating out of INS Baz in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, whose passive sonar arrays had logged the acoustic signature. 19 hours. 40 nautical miles. A submarine whose primary warload includes the YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missile, which carries a range of approximately 540 kilometers and a terminal phase supersonic sprint profile designed specifically to defeat Aegis-class intercept systems. These are not the coordinates of a routine exercise. These are the coordinates of a capabilities demonstration deliberately conducted inside the nervous system of the most strategically sensitive waterway on Earth. Approximately 21% of global oil trade transits the Strait of Hormuz on any given day. The number is not abstract. It translates to roughly 17 million barrels moving through a choke point that, at its narrowest, measures just 33 kilometers across. Every major petroleum importing economy on the planet has modeled what happens to its economy if that passage closes for even 72 hours. The models are not reassuring. What Beijing understood, and what the 19-hour loiter pattern near Thumrait communicated with clinical precision, is that the strategic calculus in that corridor had shifted. Not because China intended to close the strait, but because it had now demonstrated in operational real time that it possessed the capacity to credibly threaten to do so, and that it was prepared to exercise that capacity within sight of American carrier aviation without flinching. To understand why this matters at a structural level, you have to reach back to November 1956, to the Suez Crisis. When Britain and France, operating in collusion with Israel, moved militarily against Egypt to retake control of the canal, it was not Egyptian military resistance that stopped them. It was the United States. Specifically, Eisenhower's threat to dump British sterling reserves and collapse the pound. The lesson absorbed by every middle power strategist who studied that episode was this: control of critical maritime infrastructure is ultimately a function of which great power is willing to bear the cost of enforcing its preferences. In 1956, that great power was Washington. In 2025, at Hormuz, that calculus underwent its first serious public stress test in a generation. The Nanchang's commanding officer did not fire a weapon. He did something more precise. He demonstrated that the People's Liberation Army Navy could operate with impunity inside a theater that American strategic planning had long treated as a de facto exclusion zone. The Abraham Lincoln's air wing was present. The warning had been transmitted, and the PLA Navy loitered for 19 hours anyway, The response from regional actors was immediate and telling. Within 10 days of the satellite imagery becoming public, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman received a delegation from Beijing that included two senior officials from the Central Military Commission. Not the Foreign Ministry, the Military Commission. The meeting was not announced in advance. It lasted 6 hours. A joint communiqué released afterward referenced expanded security cooperation frameworks and mutual interests in regional stability. The specific language is diplomatic boilerplate. The timing is not. The UAE's position shifted in a parallel register. Abu Dhabi, which had spent 3 years carefully managing its relationship with Washington following the collapse of the F-35 sale over Huawei concerns, quietly signaled to American counterparts that it was prepared to re-examine the terms of basing arrangements at Al Dhafra Air Base, a facility that hosts approximately 5,000 U.S. Air Force personnel and serves as the primary regional hub for ISR operations across the Gulf. The signal was not a threat. It was a renegotiation notice, and its timing, arriving 3 weeks after the Hormuz non-confrontation, was understood in precisely those terms by the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Iran's posture is perhaps the most strategically significant secondary effect. Tehran watched the Nanchang's passage with what multiple regional intelligence services have described as careful satisfaction. Not because Iran and China are formal allies. They are not, despite the 25-year cooperation agreement signed in 2021, but because the operational demonstration at Hormuz effectively validated the deterrence logic that Iran has long relied upon, that the threat of strait closure is a credible instrument of strategic coercion, and that it has now been reinforced by a second actor whose conventional military capabilities are orders of magnitude beyond Tehran's. Iran did not gain a partner at Hormuz, it gained a precedent. Now consider how these vectors converge on oil markets, because the financial dimension of this episode is where the strategic logic becomes most legible to the average observer. Brent crude futures spiked 4.3% in the 48 hours following the Middlebury publication, before partially recovering as markets absorbed the official American framing. But the more significant movement was in the options market, specifically in the pricing of out-of-the-money call options on crude futures dated 6 to 18 months forward. Volatility premiums in those contracts rose and did not fully retreat. Sophisticated institutional traders were not buying the de-escalation narrative. They were pricing in a new baseline probability of disruption, not imminent disruption, but structural uncertainty of a kind that had not been present in Hormuz risk modeling for the better part of 2 decades. For America's Asian treaty partners, the implications are acute. Japan imports approximately 90% of its crude oil through the Strait of Hormuz. South Korea's figure is comparable. Both governments have been conducting quiet internal assessments of their strategic exposure in a scenario where the PLA Navy maintains persistent operational presence in the Gulf region, and where the United States can no longer offer the implicit guarantee of uncontested maritime access that has underpinned the entire post-war economic architecture of the Indo-Pacific. Tokyo's defense budget trajectory, already committed to doubling as a share of GDP under Prime Minister Kishida's framework, now carries a sharper urgency. The question Japanese planners are asking is not whether America would defend the strait. The question is whether American deterrence is sufficient to prevent the situation from arising in the first place. After January 14th, that question no longer has a clean answer. In Washington, the political dimension arrived with characteristic speed. Senate Armed Services Committee hearings scheduled for late February were expanded in scope to include PLA Navy force projection capabilities, a subject that had previously been addressed primarily in classified settings. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth faced pointed questions about what specific instructions had been transmitted to the Abraham Lincoln's task force commander and why no interdiction action had been taken when the Nanchang failed to respond to the back-channel warning. The answers given in open session were partial. The answers given in closed session have not been reported. But 3 senior Republican senators emerged from that closed session and introduced within 1 week a joint resolution calling for expanded naval appropriations specifically designated for Gulf of Oman and Arabian Sea presence operations. The legislative machinery moved, which means the alarm registered. What we are watching, across all of these data points, is not a single incident with a beginning and an end. It is a threshold event, the kind of moment that historians will eventually be able to identify as the point where one strategic era closed and another opened. The Hormuz non-confrontation of January 2025 did not transfer control of the strait. It did something more durable. It introduced doubt. And in the architecture of deterrence, doubt is the solvent that dissolves guarantees. Every ally, every adversary, every hedge fund manager pricing crude futures, and every defense ministry calculating basing agreements now operates in an environment where American maritime primacy in the Persian Gulf is a variable, not a constant. The American century was not built on military superiority alone. It was built on the credible, unchallenged assumption that American military superiority would be exercised wherever it was tested. On January 14, 2025, the PLA Navy tested that assumption in the most consequential maritime corridor on Earth. The Abraham Lincoln's Carrier Air Wing did not scramble. The strait remained open. And that, more than any missile fired or ship sunk, is what changed everything. Subscribe to the Proxy Signal. We'll be here when the next development breaks.